Well, yeah, I mean, just as you said, modern life, I feel like it's a big umbrella, but I think if there is a connection between these different pieces about, all these different subjects and parts of modern life and sort of different relationships, it's like comes from a common impulse of me trying to put my finger on what feels hard to people or feels like it's a
Hmm.
change from things how things used to be, something that feels different. And I think sometimes people can't quite like they feel very alone in it because they're not exactly sure what the evolution is or whether it's
Hmm.
just something that's affecting them personally, whether it's sort of like, why does life feel so hard sometimes?
Hey, Faith, Frank Schaeffer here.
Hi, good to virtually meet you.
Yeah, good to virtually meet you. I'm not asking for your name and address and social security number and mother's maiden name, but where are you right now?
Totally fair to ask. I'm in Brooklyn in Crown Heights.
Oh,
Uh,
good. Okay. Well, my granddaughter works and lives in Brooklyn too.
oh,
So,
lovely.
yeah, so she's down there, my grown granddaughter. Hey, and where are you from originally? Where do you hail from?
I'm from northern New Jersey, so not too far from here at
Not
all.
too far. You can just almost walk home.
Yeah, exactly. It would take a while, but I could do it.
And how long have you been living in Brooklyn?
Um, I have been here for 3 years now. I was in Washington, D.C. before that for about 4 years and went to school in upstate New York, so I've stayed very East Coast.
Where did you go to school upstate?
Vassar College in Poughkeepsie.
Yeah, I know where it is. And when you were in DC, were you writing already for the Atlantic, or was this after you moved?
I moved there in 2017 and I started at the Atlantic in 2018. So there was a year beforehand, and then yeah, I've sort of had a journey in my years here. I was doing sort of some project management stuff and then editing, and now I'm happy to be writing full time.
Oh, that's good. And basically, as a staff writer, I guess that includes a paycheck more than say just if you're writing pieces. You is this full time
Yes, yeah. Got the
with
benefits and
benefits? With
everything.
benefits?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
Very lucky.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I'm going to introduce you properly here in just a second when we go live, which we have here. So. All right. No more chit chat for a bit. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Faith Hill. And Faith is a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine, which also happens to be my favorite publication in all the world. It's one of the few things I read cover to cover. Subscribe, get a hard copy, and read online. And I am one of your avid fans, Faith. So I think I reached out to you. Was it because of a particular article, or did I just generally say, "Can I interview you?" I forget how we first made contact here. I emailed you and said, "Let's talk." But was it
Yeah.
about an article in particular, or just in general?
I think it was in general, yeah. Is I think you said relationships and families, which is
Yeah, that's the
my
thing.
work.
So let me dive in here and introduce you by going to some of the titles of things you've written, the most recent being September 19, Dating App Diversity Paradox. Online dating can be alienating and exasperating. It could also lead to a more integrated world. 20 somethings are in trouble. They're more depressed, more anxious, and lonelier than any other age group in America, but their distress has gone widely unnoticed. People who quit dating, being single can be hard, but the search for love may be harder. More people should be talking about IVF the way Tim Waltz is. Reproductive rights are almost always framed as a woman's issue. Waltz reminds us they affect men too. The painful reality of loving a conspiracy theorist. What do you do when family members fall for QAnon? Kamala doesn't have to be quote, mamala to the whole country. You don't need a child to know how to care for others. By the way, I love just that subheading there. The new age of endless parenting. More grown kids are in near constant contact with their family. Some call this a failure to launch, but there's another way to look at it. It's time to stop inviting plus ones to weddings. Extra guests are expensive. What if we did away with them? And that could be threatening, did away with them. I like the wording there.
I
That's the
swear
sort
I
of
didn't.
thing when, if Elon Musk tweeted that, they'd say, he's advocating killing wedding guests, but because you're a good person
Not
and we
me.
know where your heart's at, I won't misinterpret that. Um,
Thank
your childhood home might never stop haunting you. Nostalgia for a dating experience they've never had. Golden age of dating doesn't exist. Can you ever really escape your ex? Don't tell America the babysitter's dead, etc. And I want to go to one of the pieces you wrote that I read when it came out. As I read everything of yours, literally, I read every word of what you write. Why don't
thank
people teach
you.
people how to parent? Oh no, like you're talking to a fan here. You're a rock star in my world. Why a good rock star? You don't trash hotel rooms. You write about families.
No,
Why
very
don't
different.
we teach people how to parent? And this was an article that came out subtitled "The Ways That Americans Used to Learn Child Rearing Are Falling Apart. The New Ones Aren't Filling the Gaps Left Behind." And I'll just go down to a quote here that I highlighted to read. Trobe, which is someone you were interviewing, told me that when she had her first child, she was having a hard time breastfeeding. So she went to a lactation consultant. Feeling like a failure, she asked, "Why is this so hard?" And the consultant said, "Because your village has been completely eroded." And I thought that if I was going to pick a quote from any of your pieces, and I hate to describe you to you, and you can tell me, what I've got wrong here. But I think if I had to describe Faith Hill to someone who didn't know her work, brilliant work, beautifully written work, well researched, documented, gorgeous work, I would read them that quote and I'd say, what Faith has been doing is to plead for a reintroduction of all of us, whether it's dating or breastfeeding or child rearing or family structure, to recreate the village we have lost. And I thought that quote of yours within that article said it all, but also kind of describes, what your job is, what you do, if I had to characterize that, and it's to fight for the village or what's left to it of it. I don't know if that even touches close to the way you think of yourself. What about it?
Yeah, I love that way of thinking about it. I did love that, quote from that source. As soon as I heard it, I was like, oh, it is about the village.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, recently someone pointed out to me that I'm often writing about things that are like, could be seen as very depressing, but I actually don't think of my work as bleak really, because I think I do like I've, you know, I've stumbled into a pattern of sort of like establishing these holes in community and like ways
Yeah.
that people are struggling, but ultimately to say like we can't necessarily go back to the same systems that we used to have, but
Yeah.
and I think this is true in parenting and dating and a lot of what I cover that, we need to find some new way forward. And I
Mm.
think it ends up being pretty, earnest
Yeah.
in kind of trying to inspire conversations about how to do that.
Yeah, and you do brilliant research. Your work does not come packaged the same way. And tell me how to pronounce this writer's name properly. Twingy,
I've heard
Jean.
twangy before, but
Okay, because you
yeah.
know what, we've got to interview her. We're one degree of separation from her with a whole bunch of authors. We've been doing the book. I interview a lot of authors. One of them, for instance, we did called Boy Mom by someone who had just written this book on being a parent of three boys in a time when people don't cater to boys very much.
Mhm.
So and everybody quotes her. So it's time, I get to interview her on this podcast of mine. But the thing is, with you, I love the tone you take. And before we get into the specifics of what you write about, because all these subjects, we could do one podcast on each of your articles and go into the subject. Where did this start with you? I've always been, every time I read some people's articles, I'm trying to picture the person. So
Mhm.
I'm 72 years old. People say, "What do you do?" I know they mean, "What do you do for a living?" What I do is right now I take care of three of my youngest grandchildren who literally live across the street. So right now, before I did this program with you, there is chicken, rice, and gravy ready to go. The rice is in the rice cooker on the stay warm setting. I'll drive from here down to my grandson, 14-year-old grandson's soccer match. There I will meet my 10-year-old granddaughter. I pick her up from school every day. We will watch the soccer match. Then my 16-year-old granddaughter will climb into the car and I will hand them each some chicken rice and gravy to eat on the way home because they always like snacking. I've been, my wife and I, Jeannie, have been taking care of them now since they were born, which is 16 years ago for my this grandchild. I have two grown grandchildren, one who lives in New York City near you, and that's how I see my life. I also happen to earn my living as a writer, but I see my life as a caregiver, as a parent and a grandfather.
Mm.
I got there through life experience. I'm 72 years old. You aren't 72 and you come from different sort of things. So the first thing I want to do, and then I'm not going to talk so much, so don't worry. I'm interviewing you, not myself. Um,
Please.
who the hell is Faith Hill? Why is she so wise? Why at 72 do I read your pieces and say, yep, she gets it? Again, subject after subject after subject in terms of what makes human life worth living and what you're struggling for. Who the hell are you? And where do you come from? And why do you gravitate toward these subjects that actually have to do with real life more than any other writer I know? I mean, again and again and again and again, your articles hit us where we really care about it. So if I talk to my 30 something granddaughter who's grown, because I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18, do the math, all my grandchildren are older, all my, and so forth. The questions she talks about in terms of online dating fit exactly with what you write about. When I look at my connection with my own family, it fits exactly what you write about. So enough said from my point of view, but I really want to dive into why you have gravitated to this subject and why you seem to bring such a wealth of knowledge and how come you've got this kind of innate wisdom to your pieces that I don't find in other people. I don't, when I read a lot about these issues, and you're the best, you're the one that really nails it. And you go for the juggler on the subject, it's the important stuff. And then you really bring a kind of a wonderful sense to that, which my 72 years of experience bears out. How can this be?
Well, that means so much. I mean, thank you. That's so, so kind. But I would say, I'm not sure that it is that it's my wisdom. I think like I seek out wise people, and a lot of what goes in my stories is just things I've learned from them. Like I try to be a good listener and just kind of take
Hmm.
it in. I think there's a lot of people who have things to say who are sort of looking for someone to hear that story.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think I got into this kind of story because I actually majored in cognitive science
Hmm.
when I was in college, and I was really thinking I was going to do sort of a straightforward research path, get a PhD and work in a lab. And I realized like I was more interested in the questions than I was the methods.
Hmm.
So I, had really enjoyed these classes because I loved reading about other people's research. But then when I started like doing it myself and, internships and stuff, I realized like I just wanted to be sort of like hearing about
Hmm.
the questions and the answers people are trying to find and what the studies say. Um, and so that sort of led me, in a very winding path. But I think like that sort of, I feel very lucky now that my job lets me
Hmm.
think about human relationships and the mind, and you sort of weave in some of the same.
Hmm.
It was always like the big existential philosophical questions that I think
Yeah.
I found most interesting, and now I get to think about them, but also explore them just by like talking to other people
Hmm.
and following my curiosity and kind of um, just weaving that into the writing. It's just very much like you could think of it as qualitative research, but
Hmm.
that's, I think that background is kind of reflected in what I do.
What's your personal family background? And I'm not asking you to share things that you don't want to, but for instance, I come from an evangelical right-wing activist 70s background where I was my evangelical father's nepotistic sidekick for a while. Along with C.
Mhm.
Everett Koop, we sort of began what is now the evangelical anti-abortion movement with a film series and book called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. I left all that, but everything I do now is seen through a lens of someone who was very active in an area and at an age that I now regret. And so my struggle is always to try to find something that leads to a better place, having been in what I regard a mistaken place at one point. But my journey was always moderated by the fact that because I got married young, had children young as a teen,
Mm.
I discovered that what mattered most to me was not the movies I made in Hollywood during a number of years or some of the books I've had that have been successful, but grimly hanging on to the one thing that never changes, and that is I love Jeannie. I'm glad we had the three children we did. I love my grandchildren. Everything else becomes increasingly peripheral the older I get. I
Mm.
understand that life experience, but I want to get as personal as you'll let me get with you when I say who are you? I mean it in that sense, not the professional interest, but where do you come from? Your parents, your mom, your family, your connections today, what formed you? Because I think you take yourself for granted. There's nobody out there writing the body of work like you're writing. There's people like Esther Perel who writes family relationships and sexual counseling and so forth from a professional sort of helper point, and Jean Twenge and so forth. But you're the one who nails it every time in your pieces. It's like, no, now I've heard somebody really wise, way beyond the experience I would expect looking at you now. And I'm not trying to guess age or anything, but I just keep going back to this. Did you wander out of some wise cloister in the mountains somewhere and come down to us to enlighten us? I mean, where did you come from?
Well, I wish I could say I did that, and I wish I had a more interesting sort of origin story, but I mean, I think in a lot of ways my background is, it's pretty uninteresting. I'm from New Jersey and, I grew up sort of in the suburbs. But I do think a lot of what I write about ultimately like reflects things that are personal interests for me.
Yeah.
When I was a young kid, my parents got divorced, and I lived with my mom, and so
Mm.
we're extremely close. And I think, like, I just wrote this piece on endless parenting, sort of,
Yeah.
ways that a lot of young adults are still close with their parents. And of course, I
Mhm.
was very much thinking of her. Um, I think also I grew up going to Hebrew school, and it was like a Reform synagogue, and I think
Mhm.
we very much just like they would order pizza and we would sit around and talk about like, sort of ethical questions and get into
Mm.
meaty discussions. And I think that I loved that every week. And I've managed to, I think, find a career that is like as close to that as possible, where I can just hear people say interesting things. And I'm sort of, it's like, yeah, I think has been sort of informed by that. And yeah, I also think there are very mundane things that have happened in my life that nevertheless have gotten me thinking a lot about the need for belonging and community and sort of the ways to find that and just the real concrete difference when you feel surrounded by connection or not.
Mm.
Things that almost feel like it's too silly to bring up. Like, I went to a new school in sixth grade, and I really struggled to make friends that year, and I felt like so completely isolated and alone. And then in seventh grade, made new friends who I'm still close with, and just
Mm.
like experiencing the difference between those 2 years, I think it's so, I mean, so many people have some similar experiences, and it's not very interesting at all, but I do think it's still on my mind. Like I still wake up
Yeah.
every day sort of like in some way, if not consciously, like thinking about sixth grade.
Yeah, no, I get that. And the thing is with your pieces, what I love is they're sort of drawn from what you're calling ordinary mundane life. But of course, that's what our lives are made up of. I mean, I went to a periodontist the other day because I had a terrible thing and he's fixed it. And why did I like this guy? Because he took his gloves off and I wasn't even a client. He didn't know who I was. He walked the length of the hallway, came over to me, stuck his hand out, and he said, "What can I do for you?" And I was talking to his receptionist. Well, the guy who runs the thing doesn't usually do that. That's going to stay with me to the rest of my life. I was in pain. Someone reached out. It's a mundane experience. No, it's not. That's, he did what humans do at their best, and it didn't cost him anything, and it's given me something to rejoice for the last 3 weeks. I've been thinking, yep, I met
Mhm.
somebody really good in the medical profession who basically redeemed every time I've been put on hold for 10 minutes trying to call an insurance company. Nope, you
Yeah.
know, Dr.
It
Burek,
is.
periodontist in his office, treated me like a human. And these are huge things. So when you say you made a friend in seventh grade, I'm thinking about the sad year that my granddaughter had in middle school. Middle school, by the way, is shit. We all know this.
Yeah.
You're good through kindergarten, maybe first, second, third. It starts getting iffy. Then it turns out that girls aren't very nice to each other sometimes. And if you're a father or grandfather, you help pick up the pieces. But what I love about your pieces is that they are drawn from that kind of experience, which I imagine some of your interest in dating, also online stuff. You've grown up looking at a phone. How has that part of your life played into what you're writing?
I mean, I think from being in it myself, I'm single and I've been single for a while, and I do feel like I've sort of taken on the dating beat a little bit accidentally, like partly because I just think it's sort of actually more interesting and sort of intellectual than people give it credit for sometimes.
Yeah,
But I also think when I talk to sources for those stories, I can like very much come from a place of being like, I get it. Like, there's no judgment here. I'm in it myself.
sure.
And I don't think that's always necessary. Like, I write about parenting, and I'm not a parent, but I do think there's a lot of people who are very, frustrated by the dating world right now, and I do sort of have, my feet on the ground in
Yeah.
that area.
Yeah, let me ask you, and specifically, just sort of an overview. You because of your reporting and the interviews you've done with so many people, you know a lot about all these subjects, and you've written about them in terms of family relationships, child raising, dating, all these things. And by the way, when you touch things that I know well, I'm not on the dating scene, and I've never used a telephone in any form, smart or otherwise, to try to hook up with anybody on any level, other than talking to my literary agent or something. But I could have done that on a rotary telephone in 1960. So I'm a total outsider to this. But when you get into subjects that I do know about, in terms of parenting, for instance, which I do know something about, I always feel that you have a sort of a worldview which permeates that generous, open to people, but at the same time a real critical faculty. You're ready to point out where things aren't working well. How would you describe the body of your work? In other words, if all of these pieces of yours were turned into essays in a book, what would this book be about and what would the title be? Because I think there's an overarching philosophy, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. How do you describe what they all kind of add up to say? Because I think really you're saying something about the value of relationships over and above every other aspect of our life. You're not a careerist. It's interesting. You're very successful at your career, but your priorities seem to be human connection on every level, whether it's the phone dating thing or parenting or being close to your mom. What's the book about? If these were, you've got book length right there. Today I was looking through all the essays again, and you've written a book, which I encourage you to put together as a series of essays on modern life. I think is brilliant. But what's the book about? What are you trying to say through all of it? What are your priorities?
Well, yeah, I mean, just as you said, modern life, I feel like it's a big umbrella, but I think if there is a connection between these different pieces about, all these different subjects and parts of modern life and sort of different relationships, it's like comes from a common impulse of me trying to put my finger on what feels hard to people or feels like it's a
Hmm.
change from, how things used to be, something that feels different. And I think sometimes people can't quite like they feel very alone in it because they're not exactly sure what the evolution is or whether it's
Hmm.
just something that's affecting them personally, whether, it's sort of like, why does life feel so hard sometimes?
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly that's like dating and parenting, and also I think like friendship. And I even wrote about like cousins, like all these sorts of
Hmm.
relationships have these very specific modern roadblocks, which is not to say that those didn't exist in other times.
Hmm.
But people want a way to understand what's going on right now, making them feel alone or making it difficult to connect. So I think I'm trying to like, on the one hand, contextualize that feeling for people and say, Usually it's not totally new. So it's
Hmm.
like two parts of it. And I think the first part is helping people understand why often the problem that is feeling like it's, just plaguing them is actually in some ways a totally existential one, like one
Hmm.
as old as
Hmm.
time that's been plaguing people. And I think remembering that can help people feel less alone. And then the second part of it is sort of saying, but that doesn't mean that, there isn't sort of a specific version of this issue that we are currently dealing with.
Hmm.
Here's why, here's how this is showing up in modern life. And here's how we can think about, bridging whatever gap it is, or making connections, or
Hmm.
communicating about what feels sort of like a new existential issue, but is not totally new.
That's my phone that I forgot to turn off. Speaking of being driven to phone dating, which I'm not doing, but I have a question for you that's sort of related to all of this. I read you very faithfully, and I read a lot of commentators in various publications. And I've interviewed a number of people, like Tim Alberta and others, who have written for The Atlantic at different times. Um, and a question that I had, kind of to change the subject here for a minute, is,
Mm.
having talked to Tim Alberta, David Frum, Gerald Baker, who was the Wall Street Journal editorial page editor for a while, or no, he was the editor, the managing editor of the paper. Um, Author and journalist Keith Boykin and so forth. I've asked them this question: not just how do you see yourself, but what do you feel the role of the media is in an age of information overload? And I think that's a good question for you, because a lot of the frustration, kind of angst, and the existential dilemma that you cover is the kind of overload of information, even if it's not directly from the media,
Mhm.
just too many choices. So how do you see yourself as a journalist and a writer? Because as well as being a commentator, you really are a journalist. You're ferreting out stories and trends. How do you see your role? What is the media supposed to be doing now in the best of all worlds? What does the Atlantic stand for? What do you stand for in terms of that kind of, just, okay, you're a media person. And how do you see that role? Or don't you think about that? Do you just kind of do what you do and let it flow? How have you given that some thought?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, for me personally and the kind of writing I do, no one is going to go to my author page to sort of hear about the news. And I think we talk sometimes at The Atlantic about like clarifying the moment.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like people can get news from other places and sort of hear what the moment is, but when they're sort of trying to step back and understand it
Hmm.
and think more deeply about it, they hopefully come to us. And I think even though, that often we talk about that in relation to politics and like world and national news events, I think it makes sense for my writing too. I think I often write about things that other people are writing about, just in terms of like
Sure.
subject matter. But I try to sort of think about what questions people might still have, or what is not being answered, or talked about as much. So, for
Mm.
instance, I just wrote this piece about people who quit dating, and I was feeling like I had read a lot of stories about, but first of all, just frustrations with dating
Yeah.
apps. It's been a ton about that. And I'd also seen some stuff about, quitting dating in the sense of like deleting the apps. So sort of like the people who are deleting the apps for their summer, or
Yeah. Yeah.
and I felt like there was a more existential question that wasn't getting answered, that was like,
Mm.
well, what if someone, isn't just taking a pause on dating and then eventually finding someone to spend the rest of their life with?
Yeah.
Like, what if that never happens? And if dating is so frustrating, then like, where do people go from here? Sort of the next step of that.
Yeah.
And I think people are very uncomfortable talking about, the idea of being single forever. Like, people are kind of like, no, that's not going to happen.
Mm.
Um, or we'd like to talk about, people who don't want to find a partner, which is also
Yeah.
totally valid, and we should be talking about that. But I was interested in the people who did want a partner and hadn't found one yet, and sort of like, what
Mm,
if they never do, and how do they face that reality?
mm.
Um, so yeah, I'm sorry, this is kind of a winding answer, but I just sort
Good
of
answer. Keep
I
going.
yeah, I think it would be an impossible task if I was trying to just find the stories that no one had touched
Mm.
at all. But I do, in conversations with people and just like listening to what people have to say, I'm trying to find those parts that people are still feeling alone with, and add to that conversation another
Yeah,
layer.
and you're definitely a voice out there. There's someone who I have a connection with, not a personal connection, but a weird connection, and that's David Brooks at the New York Times, who writes, forget that he's a conservative columnist and has to do that shtick sometimes, but an underlying theme of his writing is connection and also kindness, and how we need to look for ways to introduce connection and kindness into our kind of modern mix, whether we're conservative or liberals or whatever. And David uses an example, kind of like your seventh grade example, where he talks about being a good friend with Jim Lehrer, who was the journalist at the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour on PBS back in the day. And Jim actually became a friend of mine because when my son was in the Marine Corps, my son John, the father of these grandchildren I take care of, fighting in Afghanistan, Jim had me on several times to do commentaries on his show, and he would send a camera crew to my house as a Marine parent and have me make a commentary, and they got a huge response. And it was at a time when I also wrote several pieces for the Washington Post about the experience of being a military parent. This is when people still liked our wars and were interested. And after they went south, nobody even wanted to know. But these were, my son was in the early days, 2002 through four, in combat right after 9/11. So my point being here that David Brooks often talks about at coming into the news hour as a commentator, and the way that McNeil Lehrer would always prioritize the relationship with the people he was working with. And the strange thing is, I mean, Brooks has been immensely successful, and probably many more people know his name now than they would Jim Lehrer. Um, but it was such a pivotal thing for him in terms of shaping his life that even as a conservative commentator, he keeps going back to kind of a baseline of connection and kindness that happened because of this friendship. And I found the same thing with Jim Lehrer. He was you remember him less as a journalist than as a lovely person that you would like to be like. When I grow up finally, I want to be like Jim Lehrer. I'm 72. I'm sort of running out of time to become like him, but he was like that kind of a person. And I find that in your work. It's as if somewhere in the back of your mind there's an ideal, and I want to be very specific about this. You know, as a 72-year-old white male, I have no idea what your dating scene is at all, because to me, falling in love was always organic. It was face to face. It was someone you met somehow in what seemed like a normal way. And I know that's a weird word, but a natural, organic way. I want to ask you a question that frames both the kindness David Brooks thing, but also this dating scene thing, and me being kind of out of that loop. Right now, if you had to pass judgment on the moment of history you're in
Mm.
terms of technology and quote advances, remains to be seen whether they were advances or not. Um, Aside from the fact that I'm this old white guy who doesn't know what the hell's going on because I'm out of the picture, do you think that all these options and choices have actually advanced human contentment? Are people better off now because they can swipe right or left? I don't even know how you do that, but you hear about it. You meet all these people. How's it? If I be a little smartass and facetious, I'd come to you as the modern young woman, and I'd just say, "Hey, how's all this working out for you?" I've been married 54 years. I have three grown children, five grandchildren. I adore them. They adore me. I've spent a big chunk of my life being an asshole and learning how not to be one. So no, it was not all good. But is this what you guys are after? Or have I wasted my life because I didn't have this high powered career in New York City doing all this fancy shit and dating all these people, and I haven't slept with enough people to know what sex is about, whatever. How do you see it? Am I just this old irrelevant old fart, or do you want what I've got? Is there any way to get from where you're you and your phone are to where I am, or is that path now closed and you've got to go a whole new way? Is it better? Is it worse? How do you see it? It's a big question, but I'd like to really hear you out on it because if anybody knows what the hell they're talking about, it's you.
I think it's a big question, but it's a good question. And I mean, I hope it's not disappointing that I think like the answer is a little bit of both. Like there
Good,
are
good.
very unique problems that I think, in dating
Hmm.
and in other realms are specific to technology and the, ways that's shaped our lives. But I also think um, people sometimes like take that to the sort of extreme of
Yeah.
things are, worse because of technology in every way. And I think it's like often both worse and better. So, if you take dating, on the one hand, there are very real reasons why I think dating apps are difficult for people. And I think, as you were saying about sort of the endless feeling of choice and too many options, I think that does sort of create, this sense that people have of like there's always something else better out there. And that shapes sort of the psychology of dating in ways that are hard for people. And I think just, it's exhausting to swipe through all these options. It's disconnecting people from the humanity of dating face to face. And yet, it's also really solving a problem that was very real to people in the past. So, it's uh, like first of all, dating has always been hard. I think it's been difficult in different ways throughout history, and I think one of the ways that it has been hard for people in the past is like you couldn't really control things. You didn't, especially women, didn't
Hmm.
have a lot of autonomy.
Right.
So that was certainly true in sort of, traditional matchmaking systems, but also just if you, were hoping that you would meet someone and, friend of friends or at work or something who would be right for you. It takes
Hmm.
a lot of luck. And for some people that worked out great. And for some people, it just didn't happen to. And then they didn't have any way to try to, actively go out there and try to find love. So I think a lot of people who sort of despair about the apps, I totally get it. And I've been there myself, but I also think it probably would have been hard in a different way at a different time period.
Yeah, I mean, if you're
If I
Catherine de
wanted to.
Medici, you're sold to the French king to make a deal with the Medicis, and you have no choice in the matter. If you looked at the history of the human race, probably 99%, if you take our whole existence, say the last 30 to 50,000 years, of women who, quote, are married or in some way paired off with people, didn't even get a say in the matter. So obviously, the past is not where the ideal is. And if there's a few lucky individuals out of the 50s and 60s like me that, found love and has stuck with it, I in no way do I hold that up as a kind of a norm and just saying, hey, this is better. You guys are missing out because it may or may not be. But there's a related question to this, and that is something that I know does bother people more of your generation and women who are writing about this, both as journalists but also books of people I've been interviewing here, and that is the kind of delayed fertility, because of course that's a bit non-negotiable. There's not an app for that. There's a narrow window, and it doesn't seem to me, and again, this may just be the old white guy talking who doesn't know anything of what he's talking about, but it doesn't seem to me that when you get into actual matters of biology and evolution, that it's just sort of fashion and optional. It's actually happens. So um, Catherine Pakaluk, who, by the way, got a good review of her book, Hannah's Children, in the New Yorker this week, a very sympathetic review given the New Yorker's usual stance on these things, has written this book where she's interviewed 50 women, most of whom have PhDs, and they've chosen to have 5 children or more. They started young. They've completely gone the other way of the sort of careerist approach of delayed childbearing, and she's interviewed them, and she's a very intelligent. She's an economist. She teaches at Catholic University of America, PhD from Harvard, brilliant woman, fabulous person. I've interviewed her, with a totally different view of things. And of course, there would be people who would say, well, Catherine's crazy. She's a Roman Catholic fanatic, which she's not. Um, she finds that most of these women are serious about some religion, whether they're Jews or Christians or Muslims, that they look for a spiritual quality to their life rather than simply career. So they have a difference of opinion. But of course, I think when you pitch it the other way and you look at the statistics of people who are in their 40s saying, if I'd known what I know now about having a child, I would have either had more children or started earlier. There's a certain level of regret. And by the way, it's a male thing too. If you're someone who watches any kind of television or talk shows, a recurring theme is older guys who say, if I knew now what I knew, I thought then, I realized my life kind of started when I had this child, whatever it might be.
Mhm.
There, I think there's a real disconnect with my generation that sort of assumed that fertility, biology, these were real things, and you kind of went along. So maybe the dating apps provide a different option, but I don't think that biology has itself been undone and remade by technological innovation. I'm not talking about contraceptives and this kind of thing. It
Mhm.
just seems to me that I know a lot of people whose pattern of life itself seems to be out of step with some of their deepest, most fundamental biological longings, male and female. And I don't see how to put that back together again. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the delayed fertility question is sort of it's another one of these both end things. Like
Yeah.
I just wrote this story about how young adults are suffering with depression and anxiety and
Yeah,
loneliness
I
at
read it. Good
very high
story. Another
rates.
great one.
Thank you. Um, and one of the things that came up is that there is this sort of gap between when people are younger and they're sort of still in their family of origin and
Mhm.
very much embedded in that, and people are taking care of them, and when they have, a family of their own, which can give
Yeah.
people a sense of meaning and purpose. And I think you're right that a lot of people do still want that. And and because people are having that later now, there's sort of like a, gulf in between where not just for that reason, for a lot of reasons, but people feel sort of very lonely. They haven't built their own community yet. Their friends have scattered to all different places, and so I think there are real, sort of ways that it can be hard to have this young adulthood that has been turned into like a longer transition.
Hmm.
But then, as you're saying, it's like the answer to that isn't, just that people should have kids longer, because there's the whole
Sure.
sociological, phenomenon is partly because people, for many reasons, feel they can't. And like, people are often not financially ready. And there's just so many sort of interconnected trends.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is often why I go back to that kind of uh, it helps to know what used to be and what's in our past to
Hmm.
understand our present, but we can't just go back
No, we
and sort
can't.
of poking at the nostalgia. And so yeah, I think we need to talk about like what relationships fill that place. If people are having families later and more of them not at all.
Yeah, and the people who choose not to have, I have three children of my own. Two are married with children. One is not. He's 50 years old at this point. He's an incredible teacher. And, there are kids in medical school who are saying, thank you for all the extra math tutoring you gave me while cooking me lunch, or I wouldn't be here. So he too is a mother, if I can be facetious for a minute. He's as much of a parent as I am. And I think when you have people who decide not to have kids or decide not to connect romantically with someone, this doesn't mean that they don't have human, powerful connections that can be very instrumental in helping people.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm not trying to be cute here, but right now, you're talking, you've talked about the fact that at this point you're not connected, you don't have kids. I, I know this is going to sound weird, but in a way, I'm one of your children because I look at your writing and I am instructed by it. And that has nothing to do with you being younger or female or connected or unconnected. Wisdom and truth are wisdom and truth. And when you run into it, that becomes a treasure. So you are parenting, if I can put it this way, a lot of people, including a 70-year-old guy who's looking to your writing and saying, yep, Faith's got a new article. I'm going to read it and learn something. That is parenting, if you really want to go to the source of it. And that's caring for people. So I'm not one of these people that say, well, Jeannie and I found the way to do this. Everybody should do this. But I do think that there's an illusion of modernity that we
Mm.
have sort of skipped beyond what is the common human experience. And I was really struck, a book that I'm a big fan of called The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. And people who watch this or listen will be tired of me mentioning this, but it's an incredible book. Her father founded Raytheon and decided to take her out of school or before college and spent 2 years in the Kalahari Desert with the Sand People, who were the oldest continuous surviving tribe. Most people agree they had been there in that part of the world for 80,000 years. That's 80,000, not eight. So, that's the beginning of human cognition to the present. After they left the Kalahari, it all fell apart. You had the apartheid regime of South Africa come in the 70s and destroy them. But the the village she found, the community she found, the way they took care of their children, the relationships between men and women, the equality between the sexes was something that sounded like a modern feminist wish list of childcare and all the rest of it. But she was writing pre 1970s. She was taking her notes in the 50s before it became cool to try to find alternative ways to be a woman or whatever in the modern context. Um, and what I found very interesting there is that more than any other book I've read, there is a common human um, inheritance. And the Sand People definitely had found it. Their lives were balanced, and so forth and so on. Even in the areas of fertility, because the women were so active doing the hunting and gathering. So they had 2 or 3 children apiece. This is pre-contraceptives. And because there was a different rhythm of life and physical activity. As you know, if you know women athletes, same sort of thing. But anyway, the reason I bring it up is because I think that the illusion of modernity that people like Elon Musk or the bro culture or the tech people have is somehow we've discovered something new, which means that all bets are off on things that everybody always counted on. And I don't think all bets are off. And I think one of the themes that run through your work, say romantic relationships, okay, we call it online dating now, but the truth of the fact that we need someone in our lives, most of us do, gay, straight, trans, doesn't matter, hasn't gone away. And I think your work always circles back to that somehow.
Mm, yeah, that definitely feels right to me. I feel like it takes us back to that first quote you read aloud about, how we need a village and we don't have it anymore. Just sort of right, all these ways in which we still want the same things that we used to want, and the systems for those have evolved in some ways for good, in some ways fallen apart. And
Yeah.
like, how can we think of the sort of new systems to get back to these things that people have always wanted, like, connection and support and all these buzzwords that, like community, I feel like on the one hand, we're like talking to death about these things in culture right now, and on the other hand, sometimes not actually sort of coming up with the answers or like zooming in on what, the specifics are of like what
Mm-hmm.
does community mean to people, and if it doesn't look like this anymore, what does it look like?
Mm-hmm. One thing I find is a thread running through your work, and you don't come right out and say it, or forgive me if I've missed something, but it seems to be in it. I find a lot of what you're saying is in direct opposition to, and actually contradicts in a wonderful way, what's come to be known as the sort of manosphere or bro culture, Andrew Tate, Elon Musk, these guys who basically have a very grim view of women and even children and childbearing, as in Musk saying to Taylor Swift, I will give you a child. And it sounded like a threat to me. Um, and when you look at the period in which you, Faith Hill, are a figure putting your opinions out into the world in your research, part of that context, besides the online dating and people looking for connection in a modern context, it seems to me part of that context is that this is a tough age to be a woman in. If you're in Tehran, you're getting raped in a police station because you forgot to wear a head covering. And if you're in the US, Elon Musk has declared war on you and said, what you were there for is to bear his children if you're working for him. And he's gonna get you, in vitro fertilization as well as everything else to make sure he's getting the kid he wants. I mean, this isn't science fiction. And then you've got the sort of bro culture out there, which seems to me to be as much of a looming threat to me as an older white male as it is to a younger woman. Because if this is the world we're going to live in, then basically to be a man here means that you're you worship cage fighters and assholes and all the people you hope that your daughter or your granddaughters never meet anywhere. These are jerks. And because they're smart, nerdy jerks, they've made a bundle, but they are influencing our culture. If you look at the pattern of Elon Musk's tweets, he makes my flesh crawl because they all are denigrating me as a male by holding up a version of what masculinity is that literally is a death sentence to real masculinity. Speaking of Thomas's book, because hunter-gatherers provided, they cared, they took care of not just their families, but they shared, the obligations of hunting and gathering with women who had an equal part in the community. I just hate this moment of history when it comes to the idea of manhood. And of course, we're in the middle of a political fight with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who are very much part of this manosphere, as is Tucker Carlson. And as a male, I so object to being caricatured along with these jerks as somehow that's what being a man means. I'm wondering if this is something you might look at in terms of what we are all facing when it comes to the challenge of this ridiculous mansphere, horrible, stupid, thuggish culture. And it's getting worse. It's not getting better. There are a bunch of rapists on top of everything else, speaking of Andrew Tate and all these other assholes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. And I do think in a lot of my stories, I have some version of like a
Yeah,
parenthetical that's sort of like, this can be especially hard for women. In this piece I just wrote about dating apps, like I have, that sort of
yeah,
something about how roughly half and more than half, roughly half of people or app users and more than half of women are unsatisfied with dating apps. So I do think there's often sort of a, specific thread where I feel like I need to acknowledge that there is a gender dynamic here and try to sort of subtly speak to that. But I also think that most of them aren't totally about that. And I
mm,
think I try to speak to the reader assuming some, humanity and compassion, and
yeah.
that like when you try to reach people with that, you hope that they meet you with that too. And so I think I, I'm thinking, for example, of like the story I wrote about people who quit dating. Like when I was reporting it, very understandably, a lot of what people were saying was like, dating is like impossible with men in this era, and like sort of seeing the problem, which I think has some real roots to it,
Yeah.
as being like sort of the state of men today and why that makes it hard for straight women to date. But then also I was finding all of these sort of, chat rooms where men were speaking with real like vulnerability and honesty about the dating problems that they had had, and so I didn't feel like it was, I felt like it was partly a gender issue but not completely, and I wanted to not, I wanted to speak to everyone in those parts that I did feel were universal. And one of the people I ended up talking to who was most helpful for me in my story was a straight man who, was just had really been trying very hard, very earnestly to find a partner who he loved and could, according
Yeah.
to him, treat respectfully. And it sounded very genuine. And
Mm.
and I was glad that I could include him and that it wasn't only women I was speaking to.
Yeah, I mean, when a moment ago, and I just want to say it again, I feel that these guys, this manosphere, these sort of billionaire incels, if I can put it this way, and JD Vance and the whole bit, childless cat ladies, all the way down, they are attacking me. They're attacking me because the part of my life I value most is a part of my life that they would say is feminized. And I don't regard it as feminized. I regard it as human.
Mm.
This is what being a human is. And I'm so angry with them from not defensively because I have a daughter. Fuck that. I am a man and I show that manhood by being the person my 16-year-old granddaughter calls when she needs help.
Hmm.
I am a man, and so my wife can count on me not going out and fucking around and wrecking our relationship, which she has fought for. I am a man, and so I am a caregiver of young grandchildren so that my daughter-in-law can have a fucking career. That's what men do. That's what they've done all the way back into the hunter-gatherer societies. These assholes are not real men. They're predators. And the old phrase from Victorian literature in the day and age of Arthur Conan Doyle in the late 19th century always comes back to mind when I read J.D. Vance or Musk. And there was a great stock phrase used in literature or newspapers at the time, and that is, he should be horsewhipped to an inch of his life on the steps of his club. That's what you did with people like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance and these other assholes. The idea was these people are not, it's not a question of manhood. They are outside of decent human behavior because of the way they treat women and other men. And I hate the demands they make upon me as a male to pretend I'm one of them in order to be cool in their stupid little world. And I find it with guys that I know. For instance, a gentleman who comes and helps me in my garden sometimes. He's a former Marine, he's a firefighter, he's a man's man. He could kick Elon Musk's ass, even if he's bulked up with his personal trainer. But when I get to know him and we talk human to human, he has all the same vision I do of what he wants to be to his daughter and to his wife and in the community and service. And it takes a while to get past the rubric of the fact that he also drives a big Harley and is a man's man. When you dig a little bit, he wants exactly the same thing you do in your articles on dating, in your articles on relationship. And I'm so sick of these assholes who put a block in men's minds against being that person. Kindness is not a feminine attribute. It's a human attribute. It's the only reason any of us are still here. So that's kind of my view. And one of the reasons I love your writing, Faith Hill, is because that tends to be the way you see people, and you're very kind to men as well in your articles. I think, the strength of your journalism, part of it is your attempt to be kind. At least that's how I read it.
I appreciate that. And I do think yeah, I'm trying to do that and trying to sort of reflect men in my stories going through some of the same things as you're saying. And
Yeah.
it makes me think like I work for our family section, and so we publish a lot about parenting, not
Yes.
just in my pieces, but in other people's as well. And one thing we try to be aware of is, that if we don't sort of check this, a lot of the parents we end up talking about are mothers, and,
Yeah.
the parents we interview are mothers, and we're talking about mothering. And so when I used to edit, like sometimes I would sort of get questions or notes about that, like let's make sure that we're, including fathers too, and not acting like, caregiving is only a woman's job. And I think there used to be a part of me that was sort of like, well, like that, of course that's happening because in part, like women are taking on this work and they're the ones
Sure.
doing it. And the mothers are mothering. But I do think that, sort of like you hope that it can make some difference, yeah,
Hmm.
to have that little bit of representation of the fathers who are involved in this and doing that work because they are out there like thinking of
Yeah.
these same things. And then if they never see themselves as part of that conversation, I think it's not helping anything.
Yeah. And I think it's good to point out, as I was talking about the old way, but also, Ruth Whitman has written this book called Boy Mom, and there's other people writing on this saying, yeah, but there's an even older tradition that's pre-industrial and pre-agrarian back into other parts of the human history where it's very, very clear that parenting was, the village included men. It had to. And this is our biological evolutionary inheritance. It's the modern era, starting with agriculture about 10,000 years ago, let alone the industrial age, that began to separate these occupations. But even on old Italian farms, I grew up in a Swiss peasant village, attached to this weird evangelical American commune, whole other story that I've written about in some of my memoirs. But hey, the women were out raking the hay with the men on the field. Everybody, all hands on deck. Kids were working, parents were working. There was no sort of division. It was a farming family. All the women had careers because they were all working on the farm with their husbands. There was no division of labor. in that sense, and the fathers and the grandfathers were parenting because who was doing childcare? It was the grandparents always who lived nearby. This was the normal relationship in most of the world. Grandparents were child caregivers when they were no longer physically able to do the harder labor of farming or working in the shop. And there's more and more people writing about this, and Ruth Whitman's one of them, and others as well. And I think that, so when you see that guy pushing the stroller through Central Park, the modern young father, don't always assume that the reason he's doing this is because he has a demanding feminist wife who wants to go be a columnist for the New York Times or, the Atlantic, whatever. Maybe he's gotten in touch with something much deeper and more primal in terms of the love and care of children, including infants, than is permitted in the mansphere these days to be a quote real man. I mean, there is something else going on, I think.
Mm. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm always a fan of sort of complicating the picture and finding the nuance. And I think you're right. And people have been talking a lot recently, which I'm glad about the ways that, the sort of uh, these patriarchal systems are not good for men
Mm-hmm.
either. And I think that is totally part of it. There's many, many men who want to be pushing that stroller.
Yeah. And actually, and when they do, they're saying, where the fuck have I been all my life? Who wanted to sit in a cubicle for the rest of my time staring out a window or, doing research for my law company? I've suddenly, these are my kids and I'm totally connected to them. And the other thing is, younger parents always forget this. And I pass this advice on to people. And that is, these stages are brief. This isn't the first day of the rest of your life. I mean, my daughter had her two kids young, and now she's a CEO of a company in New York, but she had the children with her until they were in kindergarten in Finland, where they were living at the time. I mean, she hasn't had her career has not suffered because she put the order in a site. I mean, men can do that too. There's no law that says you've got to get the master's degree, the PhD or whatever, and then charge straight into the next thing. And again, this is what grandparents are for, in case nobody knew. We're supposed to be around and helping with this. Let me ask you a question before we wrap up, and I'll just do my boilerplate here. Please subscribe right now on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer or In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack. It has to be said commentary at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And so the kind of wrap up question I would like to go to here is, where do you see the connection between what you write about personally, as Faith Hill in this environment? Because it seems everything is politicized. So where do you fall in that spectrum? And I'm not asking you to identify yourself politically, but I mean, do you see this as a subject you approach from a kind of politically liberal or conservative point of view? Because it seems to me when you talk about family, you're talking about things that transcend politics. MAGA people who vote for Trump have families too. It isn't like they're outsiders to the human experience. We're all in the same framework. I guess the way you would measure it is in the reaction. Do you hear more from men or women? Do you get feedback on your pieces that are politically charged, as in you lousy commie from one group, or you feminist whatever harpy from another? I mean, what's the reaction to your work been in total? Male, female, political, politicized? Are you harassed as a woman writer by these assholes who denigrate you? Just talk a little bit about your experience as a writer in terms of how you are reacted to and by whom.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly gotten the angry Twitter comments from both sides of that spectrum. But
And
I
what are
mean,
they angry about? What are they angry about?
it depends on the piece, and sometimes it seems like not even really connected to what I'm actually arguing. I think there's a lot of people who read the headline and not much else. And then, as you were reading uh, when you were reading out the headlines of my various articles, I have done a couple of, sort of more explicitly political pieces recently, and those certainly got, a lot of people, people who are angry about Tim Waltz, who didn't like that I wrote about how he talks about IVF and
Yeah.
things like that.
You get chewed up by the politics of the moment.
Yeah. But I get people who are unhappy with my pieces in other ways too. I think partly that's just, the part of the job of me putting myself out there.
Hmm.
I I don't think my work is totally disconnected from the political in the sense that, as they say, the personal is political, and like
Yeah.
if we're talking about, the things that matter to people in their everyday lives, those are things that also obviously affect what people want in their leaders and, that are related to policy. I think a lot of what I write about is ultimately related to, policy changes that could happen
Absolutely.
even if they're not on the table now. So I think it's sort of, not a connection I usually need to name, but I do think it's all about what matters to people and what support they need in their everyday lives and
Mm.
what they're not getting in that sense, and what modern life could be like, which I think ultimately is political.
Yeah. I would have put it that way. Ernie, my producer, Ernie Gregg, maybe facetiously sent through a comment. She says, "Is Faith's fan base entirely 72-year-old cisgendered white males?" Maybe
I
not. I
broader,
think a
but I
few
like that.
a few women read your stuff too, but it's primarily come on, it's for us. It's for my cohort, right?
Oh, the Frank Schaeffers of the world.
The Frank
I do
Schaeffers of the world. There's
I have a
three
lot
of
of
us. The
friends.
other two aren't feeling well. They're probably going to pass from the scene soon, but I'm your sole survivor. Yeah. So how do you see that in terms of your audience? I mean, I asked you who responds, men, women. I mean, I would imagine you get a mix.
There's definitely a mix. I think I hear a lot from women, I think because I write about um, you know, the parenting and the dating, there may be more people who feel like, it's their place to be like commenting publicly on it and sort of feel like, oh
Yeah.
yes, it's about me. But definitely both. And I was about to say I hear from actually a lot of friends that like their fathers like my work. So
Yeah. Hey,
yeah,
I told you. I told you.
yes, I've got the dad audience, and I'm happy with that.
That's because we're wise. Okay. So we know you're wise. Young
You know,
people are
and
trying to figure out who's wise. We know you're wise.
it's funny. I write a lot about sort of the, young adult issues, you could say,
Hmm.
like partly, dating, but also just like, young adult mental health and young adults
Sure.
and their parents. And so you would think that would be my audience, but I do think there's a lot of curiosity from, older audiences too, who are sort of like want to know what young people are going through and
Yeah.
yeah, as you're saying, have, people in their lives that they care about who are young. And so I don't necessarily think that's always as much of a divide as I think it might be.
Well, and people we care about who are young or maybe female or gay or trans or whatever. And when you write about that subject, my cohort, the grandfathers of the world, we want to pass on what you're writing and say, hey, last week you were talking about this experience you had. I've just read something that is interesting in regard to this. How about you read this and I'll send a link or, download the whole piece into the email in case they're going to hit the paywall or something. So I cheat a little bit, but I do send your stuff around to people who I think will be interested in it. Okay, so before we wrap this up, I have a favor to ask you. Um, and that is when we sign off here, when I leave, don't you leave. Stay on for a few minutes to talk to my producer, Ernie, for two reasons. First, we want to make sure to link to anything you find interesting we should link to, including whatever articles or the Atlantic itself or whatever you're doing. And the second thing is we would like to ask you for a favor, and that is that having had this conversation, if you're thinking, hey, Frank would really enjoy talking to fill in the blank, an author who's just written a book, or a non-author, or another writer at the Atlantic, or somebody else that you have a connection with, sort of one degree of separation, pass those names on to us
Great.
because we've had a good experience with that. Usually we're talking to someone who knows more about their subject than we do, and then they pass us on to someone else that we can have a great conversation with, other young writers, whoever it might be. So please give Ernie those names. And then, for
Great.
me personally, just thank you again for all the hours, because it adds up to hours that I've spent reading your material. And basically, my reaction to it has always been what she said. So I always finish your article saying, yeah, I wish I had written that. I didn't know enough to do that. Thank God somebody did the research. And if I'm ever asked about this subject again, I go to your articles and say, hey, Faith put it this way and she was right. And really, I really do think that what I've learned about what makes life worth living is reflected in your pieces. And I can't thank you enough.
I truly appreciate that so much. Thank you so much. It really means a lot.
Yeah, well, you mean a lot to me. So anyway, you're one of
I'll
the
try to
writers
keep
I
it up.
love. What's that?
I said I'll try to keep it up. I'll have you in
Yeah,
mind.
you keep going. And then here's another thing. Besides your little chat with Ernie, we'll have your contact information. And I'm a fan, not a stalker. Okay, so just get that straight.
I'm not worried.
But we do need your contact information because and so forth. If you ever have something you're working on, and I don't mean professionally necessarily, where we can help you, say you do that book, or
Mhm.
you run into a personal problem, and someone's harassing you, and you need someone to show up at their club and horsewhip them. Um, just tell Ernie what you need because we'll do it. I'm really following you, and we're fans. And if we can ever be assistants in publishing or whatever it might be, you just let us know because I really would like to do whatever we can to help you along.
Thank you so much. That's excellent to hear. I love it.
Ciao, tutto bene. Buon giornata, which is good. Have a good day in Italian. We'll see you.
Thank you
Stick
so
around and
much.
talk to Ernie, okay?
Okay, will do. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Oh, of course, my pleasure.
Okay.